Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the IS-BAO SafetyNet webinar series. Today's session is presented by Polaris Aero with Madeline Young and Kelly Roby, and they'll be talking about change management best practices. I am Catherine Hilst. I'm the IS-BAO Operations Manager. Let me just run through a few housekeeping items before we get started. All of the attendees are on mute, and you'll stay on mute for the presentation, but you do have a place in the control panel for this GoToWebinar session to write in your questions. Type them in as they come up. I'll be keeping track of them, and then we'll address them after the presentation in the question and answer session. So IS-BAO and IBAC, IS-BAO is a recognized voluntary safety standard that helps operators apply industry best practices by challenging them to review and compare their safety-related policies, processes, and procedures, and then make improvements, elevating them to the worldwide standard for business aviation. So I would have to say that today's subject matter is right on point for all of us as we try to continuously improve our safety programs. I'm so excited to have both of you back, Madeline and Kelly, and Polaris Aero has been doing some fantastic SafetyNet presentations for us, and today is definitely high on my list. Change management is intended to be a proactive process for systematically assessing potentially induced or residual risk in your organization. Though it's been a hot topic for a few years, organizations continue to struggle with not only adhering to regulations and standards around the topic, but also to ensure that the process is meaningful for the organization. In this session, Madeline and Kelly are going to review industry regulation standard and guidance around change management and discuss best practices to ensure you're achieving both compliance and your desired results. Madeline is the VOCUS product manager at Polaris Aero, LLC. She comes with several years of experience in the business aviation sector, including a successful run as safety specialist, ASAP manager, and VOCUS SMS administrator for a major Part 135 operation. She's also a recreational private pilot and I think you finished your master's, didn't you?
Did.
Yes, and she has her master's in engineering of advanced safety engineering and management. Congratulations on many things, Madeline. Kelly Roby leads Polaris Aero Safety Services Division, which specializes in assisting Polaris clients more effectively implement and achieve their safety goals. Prior to joining Polaris, she spent more than a decade honing her skills in Part 135 and Part 91 operations environment in roles ranging from FBO operations, flight operations, serving as a flight crew member on a Beechjet 400, Hawker 800, safety manager, and most recently a business manager overseeing both scheduling and charter sales for a Part 135 charter and management company. I'm so excited to have you here, and I'm going to hand this over to you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, on behalf of Polaris, we're happy to be here with another SafetyNet webinar. So I don't want to delay this too much. We're going to talk about obviously change management, starting with regulation and moving into some best practices that we've seen. What you'll see though are a couple of themes I just want to preface with before we jump into things. And that first theme is the concept of change management as a business practice. So keep that in mind. You'll hear that come up quite a bit actually. The next thing to keep in mind as well is once we get through the regulation component, we will move into the best practices, and the framework for that is we're going to outline basically 3 types of changes and show you 3 different methods or ways really that you can navigate the change management process in the eyes of those 3 changes. So there will be a few examples, but we do highly encourage you to submit any questions you have about any specific change that you're undergoing that you might need some help with, or anything that comes up as a result of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Kelly, and we are actually going to start with something that might be fairly obvious to some of you, which is defining the why behind what it is that we're talking about here, which is, of course, change management. So Kelly, go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all again for joining. And I assume that most of you that are on the call today are in safety related roles. Likely you hopped on to listen in today about how change management impacts you and your specific safety role. But as Madeline mentioned, this is more than just a safety process. While there are certainly some hazards or risks or safety related things we need to keep in mind, it's also a business practice. It's also great to keep this in mind as we're looking at things that impact our business. So while many of us started our roles in a subject matter expertise way of either being a pilot or in maintenance or in scheduling, and we have that background, we've also now, as we've evolved over time, maybe started taking on some more management roles, right? So we're seeing a lot more people moving into those management roles lately, a lot quicker, quite frankly, and in the current industry that or market that we're in our industry. So some things to take into account as your lens changes would be, not only how does this impact the specific role that I used to play, whether that's, again, pilot, maintainer, or specific to safety, but then also how does that impact our business? If you're taking on a chief pilot role or maybe a director role, this is just good practice to use in your business as well. So again, changing our lens, and that can be difficult because we're fixers by nature. So as a maintenance technician or as a pilot or a scheduler, we are wired in our brains for the fix, right? To get the mission done, to complete the mission in whatever way that takes. We're not so great or not so wired necessarily to document that process and to talk about what needs to go into that next time to build and evolve on it. So that's what we're here to do today. We're going to talk about how to systematically build a process that we can learn from and evolve over time to make sure that just because it makes good business sense to do that and it elevates our business process to do that, it's not lowering our standard of safety and the impacts that it has on our line personnel by doing that. And then conversely, that anytime that we are making decisions that may have an impact on safety and mitigating those risks and elevating that level, that our business process doesn't decline because of that. So we definitely don't want to safety ourselves out of business, right? So it's keeping those things in balance and making sure that we have a systematic way to look at that process over time and evolve on that as it goes. So that's really where we wanted to start with why. It's just taking our brains from the fixer mode, from the mission-driven mode that we've been used to, and then changing that a little bit, still having the impact, but changing that in a way that we can document it and then move forward with that. Madeline, I know you probably have some notes on that why too.
Yeah, those are some excellent points, Kelly. And I think what can help us really drive home that point is understanding where we've really come in our whole safety journey and our safety evolution as an industry really altogether. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about that because I do think it's very important, and it kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about in just a moment. So, once upon a time, we really believed that our system was fairly mechanistic in nature, and our system being, the aviation system or our aircraft or our operation. We believed that, we can identify every part and function and interaction, and because of that, we can identify cause and effect relationships fairly easily in a fairly obvious and linear way. And maybe if not so obvious and linear, then at least, at the very least, identifiable. So if we think back to kind of these different eras that we've migrated through, we can identify sweeping changes that have taken place, understand why those changes have taken place and how we got to where we are. So if we start with the technical era, that was kind of the first era that we saw. That era was really involved in the mechanical improvements and the bettering of technology, really mainly of aircraft. We see a huge evolution of aircraft during that time. But what we saw happen is accidents and incidents persisted. They continued to take place even though we made aircraft better, faster, stronger, right? So at that point, we began to kind of recognize that this other element of the system exists. That element, of course, being humans, us, as pilots or as mechanics. And we started to see where the human to technology component, but also the human to human component were very important components of our system. and very critical, as a matter of fact. And because of that, we need to be able to put controls in place for these interactions that we can identify so that we can better the system. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? And so that's what moved us into that human era of our safety evolution. And during this time, that's when we really saw the development of crew resource management and considerations of human performance and human factors really be taken much, much more seriously. But as we know, accidents continue to happen, incidents continue to happen. And our investigations over time showed that it's not necessarily the aircraft now that's at fault or the people that are at fault, but there's this other thing that exists that's contributing to these accidents and incidents, and that other thing is our organization, right? So the organization in which that person conducts their work can create an environment that is prone to accidents and incidents because of certain, I guess, risk controls and mitigations that either are or are not in place. And so how do we address that? Well, of course, we focused on what we could identify in the organization, and how we could interact, you know, what the cause and effect relationships would be in that system. And we created an organizational shift. That moved us into that organizational era. In that era, we saw safety management systems take a stronghold. We saw other organizational best practices become ever more present. We started to consider that it's not just the pilot and the aircraft and the technician, but there are all these other people and things involved in the system that we also need to care about, right? And safety management systems are very good at helping us be mindful of those and assess the risks associated with those, put controls in place, and move through the safety assurance component of safety management. But as we know, accidents continue to happen. And a lot of people think that we are still in this organizational era, but we've identified all of these components, we've put all of these controls in place, and things are only getting marginally better in certain aspects. And what we've identified with time is that we've really started to become much more aware that our system is not just about the human and the people, the organization and the equipment and the technology, but there are all of these other components of the system that are very difficult to identify at any given point in time. And there are also components that we can't even identify because the system is so unpredictable in nature. And so because of that, we've actually known this for quite some time. It's just a matter of actually bringing it to the right people and having the right people kind of listen and absorb and take action based on that. So because of that, we've moved into what I'd consider this more holistic era, where we're trying to look at the system holistically to have a better understanding and a respect for the complexity that we have in the system. So the main point I'm trying to make here is that we've slowly been learning something very important over time. And that is that with the addition of new concepts, new systems, new technology, a new way of doing things, and with all of those things constantly changing, we ourselves have been a very integral part in creating what we would call this very complex system. And so when we start to take that into consideration, we start to see how change management is really, really crucial and important and necessary, because identifying cause and effect relationships is much more difficult given the complexity of our systems that we're in. Then when you couple that with what we know about human psychology and behavior, we know that our memories can be fallible. We know that we kind of come to the table with all of these predispositions, with a way of doing things, and there are all these other intangible elements that have a profound effect on our ability to work. When we couple that with complexity, we really start to understand not only the need for change management, but the need to be effective in change management. And so Kelly's why is really talking about kind of this trade-off that we see between safety and business practices. And kind of the answer to that is that change management is a balance of both of these things. Our why has to do with what we've learned over time. We can't ignore what we know now about our system. And so because of that, we have to move forward. So hopefully that sets the stage a little bit as to why it is that we're even having this discussion and why it's so important. The next thing we're going to do here is move into a few definitions. There are 4 that we're going to look at. This will be fairly quick and painless, but I do want to set the stage before we move into the actual regulations and looking at some guidance material. So the first definition should be fairly obvious, and that is change management. So I'm just going to read what ICAO Doc 9859 says about change management, or how it's defined by them. And they define it as a formal process to manage changes within an organization in a systematic manner so that changes which may impact identified hazards and risk mitigation strategies are accounted for before the implementation of such changes. So there are 3 kind of key components to this change management definition. And if we say it in a different way, what we're really talking about is designing our system to be more resilient, using tactics that already exist in SMS, just making sure that those are used at the appropriate times. Another way to think about it is adaptation, or smart adaptation, right? We know that changes are going to happen, so what's the smart way to go about managing the effects that we're going to see happen because of those changes, given the complexity system that we're in? So we've talked about kind of change management as a business practice. And the point that I want to drive home with that is that it's really a business practice that's made up of all of these other safety practices. So it's not really anything new to us. There aren't new things that we need to be doing. There's just a certain way of doing things, of ordering these safety practices in order to achieve the goal of change management. The next definition is that of a hazard. Again, I'm using the ICAO Doc 9859 definition here. There are other definitions that we could call on, but just for the sake of consistency in the documentation I'm referencing, the definition we'll use is a condition or an object with the potential to cause or contribute to an aircraft accident or incident. Now, I would actually caveat this with, it doesn't necessarily only need to be an aircraft accident or incident, right? It can transcend that a bit more. It could be any kind of negative or unintended or undesired outcome that kind of we can tack on to the end of that definition. Next step would be the definition of a system. Again, Doc 9859 says that a system is an organized, purposeful structure that consists of interrelated and interdependent elements and components and related policies, procedures, and practices created to carry out specific activities or to solve a problem. So it's a collection of all of the things that we're doing and the people involved and the processes and policies and things involved in order to meet a specific goal. The definition here seems a little bit more complex than if we break it down. It's actually quite a simple definition. But what's not as simple of a definition is that of system complexity, or a complex system. This is hopefully you kind of become a little bit more aware of why complexity and complex systems is important based on what we talked about with the evolution of safety in our industry. But I still want to provide a definition here because we're going to talk about it a little bit more. It's a very critical element to our conversation today. So a complex system is essentially a system that often behaves unpredictably or randomly due to the diversity of the interactions within the system, the unpredictability of that system, and all of the changing influences upon that system. So essentially, there are certain things that we do know about our system that can be defined, that can be written down and spelled out in flowcharts and words and documents and things. But there are all of these other things that we just need to have the presence of mind of being aware that they exist, but we don't know what they are. And so there needs to be a sense of adaptability in pretty much everything that we do in safety. But the point I'm trying to make as we talk about management of change or change management is that the structure of change management allows us to ensure that we're systematically addressing that which we do know about our system. So part of complexity is what we know, the actual defined interactions, interdependencies, et cetera. And change management helps us kind of ease the burden on ourselves because it allows us to kind of formulate a plan of how we're going to address all of these things that we do know so that we can also focus some of our attention on creating a more resilient system and some more intangible ways, if you will. So we're not going to get into kind of that unknown unpredictability of the system. We're going to focus on what we do know, but understanding that that's just one component of this conversation is also very critical. So let's go ahead and move on to the what of regulations and standards. Before I jump straight into ICAO standards recommended practices, I want to take a quick minute and ask you to do two things. And the first is to think about your pre-flight briefing or your pre-shift briefing, whatever position you hold, whatever pre-activity briefing that you do. What occurs during that time? I would be suggesting or guessing that some of the things that you probably do are discuss what it is that you're actually going to do, what your work is, how it's defined, what's expected of you. Talk about any potential disruptions to that work. If there are disruptions, you'll probably do a quick mental calculation of a risk assessment, right? So what are all of the things that I need to be aware of because of that disruption, and how do I need to move forward in light of that information? And then discuss that adaptation plan given the new controls now that you need to kind of implement, or the new barriers that you need to build up or stand up or activate at that point in time. That process is nearly identical to change management. The main differences are just the size and the scope and when it's occurring and what the triggering conditions are. But the meat of those bones is looking at what it is that you're currently doing, seeing how that's going to be different based on disruptions or based on a change, and developing a plan to move forward. So it is fairly straightforward. We're doing this all of the time. Change management is just a way of codifying that and applying it on a much greater scale. So the next thing I want you to think about is a change that you've undergone recently or that you're currently undergoing. And I just want to put you in the mind space of that change, so that as we move forward throughout the presentation here and we talk through some best practices, you can apply those in a more tangible way to something that's more meaningful to you. Some of the examples that we use may not really be meaningful at all, and that's okay. There are hopefully components of them that you can extrapolate and apply to your own change that you're undergoing right now. As Catherine mentioned, we know that this has been a really hot topic for a long time, especially from an IS-BAO and IS-BAO auditing perspective. And we saw it gain a lot of attention in the last 3 years with the pandemic. And I'm not going to go into all of that. But what I do want to mention is that as we went through the pandemic, we were expected to execute on management of change. Whether we had a defined process or not doesn't really matter in the public eye, right? What was expected of us is that we adapted. And some of us had to do that in a very, very public way. And through that exercise, we learned some of the strengths that we may have in the organization, but also some weaknesses that we have. And that's, very interesting information to us. And all the while, conversations are being had, articles are being written, podcasts are being done around change management. And it's being done in a very, from what I've seen, interesting way, and that way being it doesn't really root itself in regulation. And so that's the reason I'm mentioning this, is to set ourselves up for why looking at these standards, recommended practices, is so important, because what we'll see is that there's actually a lot of latitude in the way that we conduct change management. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, so I'm going to stop there. So what we're going to be talking about in this section is what is actually required of civil aviation authorities in their oversight of us as service providers, what is then required of us as those service providers, and then what documentation or guidance exists that can help us navigate this. And once we've done all of that, hopefully then we will have established a level of confidence that what is required and expected of you, so we can just move forward into the practical implementation, and also make sure that what it is that you do is appropriate and actually meaningful for the size and scope of your own operation. We talk about size and scope a lot. I know that term is thrown out quite a bit, but it'll make a bit more sense and hopefully drive the point home here in just a moment. So with that being said, we're going to start at the highest level. here, which is ICAO, right? So if you're not familiar with ICAO Annex 19, it was basically designed to consolidate all standard and recommended practices regarding SMS. And that was, encouraged to be done in 2010, I believe was officially completed in 2013. So it outlines all these requirements for safety management systems and state safety programs. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up is because the state safety program, your civil aviation authority, is really the regulatory authority for your organization, right? ICAO isn't a regulator, but they do provide a standard. And so the states in Annex 19, Chapter 3 are required in that chapter to oversee the authority and implementation of SMS of certain organizations, that being ATC, training organizations, certain type design and manufacturing organizations, but also, of course, aircraft operators and helicopter operators. Now, there are some parameters to that, to aircraft operators and helicopter operators, and those parameters are that, first of all, you would need to conduct international operations, so flying outside of your civil authority, and then also have aircraft that weigh over 12,500 pounds or are turbojets. So there's some parameters in there, but that doesn't mean that your civil aviation authority is only going to require SMS for those organizations. Obviously, they could require SMS for more than just that, and we're seeing that kind of play out in real time here in the United States. So now that we know that there is a requirement by these states, these countries, to impose SMS requirements on certain types of organizations, then we can look at Chapter 4, which actually outlines the requirement for those service providers to have safety management systems. So it talks about that a service provider shall, so they're required to establish a framework or establish their SMS in accordance with the framework of Annex 19 Appendix 2, which we'll take a quick look at, and that the establishment of that SMS is commensurate with the size and scope of their organization and the complexity of its aviation's products or services. Okay, so then if we move into Annex 2, we actually see what the framework is for safety management systems. And I'm sure all of you have seen this before. This is those 4 components and the 12 elements of safety management systems. And if we look at safety assurance and 3.2, we can see there that is where management of change or change management actually exists. And there is one line, one phrase that is written in that appendix for change management. This is really kind of the not the end all be all, but the premise of change management. And it says that the service provider shall develop and maintain a process to identify changes which may affect the level of safety risk associated with its aviation products or services, and to identify and manage the safety risks that may arise from those changes. So fairly similar to the definition that we saw in a different documentation by ICAO. But the reason that kind of we're going through all of these steps is just to show what is actually the international standard that exists. And this is the international standard for change management. Now, in addition to the standards and recommended practices by ICAO, of course, they've developed some guidance documentation, and that can be fairly helpful for us. So the main guidance material that I'm referencing, you've seen me reference it earlier, is ICAO Doc 9859, the Safety Management Manual. And that manual is really written to support the implementation of state safety programs, but more notably for us is it also intends to support states in ensuring that their service providers implement SMS in accordance with the provisions in Annex 19, where the actual framework lives. So we can actually glean a lot from this as well. And there's some, there's a specific chapter that I would encourage you to go look at if you haven't already, which is Chapter 9 of this document. Which is the actual guidance for the implementation of SMS by service providers, not by states. So You can go and read that. It's a couple of pages long, maybe 2.5 pages or so, but I'm going to condense kind of some of the key takeaways from that guidance material as it relates to change management specifically. And those key items are that with change management, you should define your triggering conditions. So what is it that's actually going to launch you into this change management process? Okay, that's one of the key differences between change management and any other kind of risk assessment that we're doing with change management is there is some sort of definition behind what is actually instigating this whole process. The second item is to determine who is affected and what is affected, but more importantly with who is affected is what parties need to be or should be involved in the change management process. It is so easy for us as safety managers to think that this is fully our responsibility because it's in the name, it's in the title. Safety manager under safety is change management, and therefore it's our responsibility. That is partially true. It is our responsibility to oversee and to ensure that change management is being done. It is not necessarily our responsibility to complete every single component of the change management process. So I know for a lot of the audience, you may be small aircraft operators or just small departments in general, where you might not have a whole lot of people to call on. In some ways, that actually plays to your benefit. But at larger organizations, I actually see this become more of an issue, where at a larger organization, even though you have more people to call on, the silo of safety becomes that much more narrow, just because of the way that departments and organizational structures tend to build themselves in those larger organizations. So the key here is that regardless of the size of your organization, even if you're a 5-man department and you're the only safety guy, doesn't mean that you're the only one responsible just because you make up a, 1/5 of the department, right? You can still involve those other individuals, but first and foremost is you need to identify who's affected so that you know who you actually need to bring into the picture here. And the second consideration for that is that we are not all-knowing beings, right? We don't know everything. I think we can all kind of agree to that, even if at some points we wish that we were. And so when we can kind of suspend our own mentality and our own ego around this, we can start to see the importance in bringing other people into the fold, because they have their own perspective and their own knowledge that can certainly help make this easier for us. So number 3 there is determine the what that will be affected in the system. Number 4 would be to identify the hazards that we've identified. And when we talk about identifying the hazards from the change, think back to that definition that we had, a condition or an object with the potential basically for harm to the system. That can be pretty much anything. I think sometimes we can think about hazards in a very specific way, and a hazard could be a gap in a policy. It could be an inadequate policy, an incorrect policy, the lack of a policy, as an example. It could be insufficient training, a lack of training, non-existence of training, right? So there are all these different layers that we can unpack when it comes to hazards. So my point here is that a key way that we can identify hazards is to look at the way that work is designed to be done, and then separately look at how work needs to be done and see what gaps exist between those two things. How it's currently designed in documentation and in our own internal guidelines and SOPs versus how we actually need something to be done in light of this change. What are the gaps there? And now we can start to identify those hazards and put mitigations or risk controls in place. Number 5 would be to an intermediary step is to assess risk. Now we assess risk for a lot of different reasons. One being to just help us prioritize our actions, what next steps we need to take. Higher risk items are probably going to take a longer amount of time to address, but probably more critical than something else. That's the very nature of doing a risk assessment. And then finally is to create that action plan and also an assurance plan. Now, in looking at all of this, hopefully it's resonated with you to some extent in that you're already doing a lot of these practices. Maybe you don't have a definition behind triggering conditions, and we'll get to that, but you probably are already doing hazard identification at some level, risk assessment at some level, right? And change management is not designed to reinvent that wheel. It's designed to incorporate those practices that have already been defined and just do them because of a triggering condition, because of a specific change event. So with that being said, I'm going to move away from kind of these guidelines around change management in particular and look at something that is going to be a theme here in just a little while around system complexity, but also your system description. So when it comes to defining triggering conditions, what that really requires of us is to have a fairly good understanding of what our system is, what our system definition is in particular. Now, the system definition isn't necessarily a standard by ICAO, but it is listed in the guidance documentation, especially in Doc 9859. And what that document says is that the documentation should include a system description that provides boundaries of the SMS. It should also help clarify the relationships between policies, processes, procedures, practices, and define how these links serve the safety policy and objectives of the organization. So when it comes to understanding triggering conditions, we need to understand what our system is so that we know what changes would constitute a trigger and an update to that system description. System descriptions can look very different. There's not a lot of guidance as to how you're meant to define your system description and in what method you choose to do so. What you see on the screen here is just one very simple, quick, high-level example of a system description, and it's just a simple mind map. All I've done here is define what our system goal is, what our purpose is, which is operating and maintaining aircraft under certain regulations to meet business and operational goals. And in addition to that, I've defined all of these different areas that exist in our system. So our departments, our programs, software, equipment, interfacing persons, our operating environment, and our facilities. This isn't a comprehensive list, but it's an example of that. And then branching out of each of those nodes are anything that would exist within them. So for programs, we've listed all of the programs that this particular organization has. For software, same thing has occurred. For equipment, we've listed out all of our equipment. And so when you start to develop your system description, what you're doing is you're taking some of the complexity that exists and you're putting it on paper. Again, whether it's a description, whether it's a mind map like this, whether it's a flow chart, doesn't really matter how you do it, but you're putting it down on paper so that in the future, when there is a change, you don't have to remember all of these different elements because you've already done that work. And when you look at your system and you've identified that something in that system has changed, that in and of itself is a triggering condition for launching change management. So we're going to talk a little bit more about system description in a little while. So we'll come back to that. What I want to end this section on is talking about IBAC and the IS-BAO. And I'm going to keep this fairly high level. Of course, IBAC does have, or in the IS-BAO 20th edition document, it does have the requirement for change management. And that requirement essentially mimics exactly what we see in Annex 19, Appendix 2. So the description of that change management requirement is basically identical for IBAC. So not a lot of differences there. But as we know with the IS-BAO, they take things a little bit further because they don't only want to see the documentation, but they want to see proof of implementation of change management. And so I'm not going to go deep into actually looking at the standard itself. You all probably have access to the protocols and to this slide. Really, my point here, though, is just that the requirements for change management for IS-BAO are identical to that of the standard and recommended practices by ICAO. They're the exact same, and there's a lot of flexibility there. it's not very prescriptive, nor is the guidance document. The guidance document isn't prescriptive in nature, it's just meant to be an assistance for you. So take anything away from this conversation, take away that there is a lot of latitude that's afforded to you in how you go about change management. There are best practices, which we'll get into. So that first page that you saw there was the stage 1 requirements for the IS-BAO, and what you're seeing here is a stage 2 and stage 3 protocols for that change management requirement. Basically, what IBAC wants to see is evidence that the organization is actually doing management of change or change management, and that they have these processes defined, that they're being documented, and that they're being implemented effectively. So quick recap, I've already talked through a lot of this. I know this is a wordy slide here, but what we see in Chapter 3 of Annex 19 is the requirement for states to oversee certain or to require SMS for certain types of organizations. Of course, we've loosely defined that. Chapter 4 then defines what those requirements are of the operators that are meant to have those safety management systems. Annex 19 Appendix 2 then defines what the framework is, so the 4 components, the 12 elements. Doc 9859 is the guidance material that helps support the implementation of that framework. IS-BAO 20th edition provides the required standard for IBAC, and then the IS-BAO guidance document will eventually provide guidance on change management. It doesn't have that component right now, but I hear that it's coming down the pipeline, hopefully this year. The caveat to all of this is that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, each state can implement to some extent their own regulations. By state, I mean, of course, countries. So don't take all of that at face value, but at least understand that there is still a lot of latitude afforded on an international level. So we're going to move forward here away from the what, now that we've defined all of that, and into the how. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to Kelly, who is going to talk about, first and foremost, what some of the barriers are to actual practical implementation, and then we'll get into the practical implementation component. Kelly, over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Madeline. I mean, listening to all of that and understanding what the requirements and what the regulations are, what we're expected to participate in is one thing. Coming at this from the person who has to do it, right? The person who actually has to implement all of these things, we see some common barriers within our groups, within our organizations that exist. The first of those being lack of knowledge or experience in the safety role itself. So especially in the current environment that we're in, where we're seeing a lot of new safety officers, a lot of new safety managers, or people moving into management roles or taking that on for themselves, you come into this, digest all of that information that Madeline just gave you, and you said, okay, now what? Now what do we do with all this information? So having that feeling of lack of knowledge or experience is your first barrier, because you have to feel like you know what you're talking about. So reference back to a few of those slides that Madeline just went over and understand that while the system is very complex and while we have a lot of moving parts to this, we can really leverage the knowledge base of our entire flight department. We don't have to act in this one silo of safety to gain that knowledge and experience of how to manage change management itself. So you don't have to have all the answers. That's the first part. Coming from, again, a pilot or a maintainer background, it is common to feel like you have to have all the answers, right? You have to be that omnipresent person that can go in and fill out the protocols and the checklist and make sure that you've got that down. But reaching out to your organization, collectively getting that information back from the group, and then implementing this change is the best way to do that. And then the last one would be just clarity about what needs to be accomplished and when. So again, clarity about what needs to be accomplished in regards to what the regulations say and what is expected of us. Again, referencing back to Madeline's slides, now we just have to define as a group, as an organization, what we want to do related to our own size and scope. What do we feel like is appropriate to be implemented based on our size and operational pace? So this doesn't have to be rocket science, right? It doesn't have to be, we're not going to the moon here. We can do this via, honestly, you could write it on a cocktail napkin. if you wanted to. That's documenting it. That is what you could do. You could have a Word template, an Excel file, something like that. Just as long as we have a way to document what we're doing, that's the important part. Right here, you'll see it on the screen that we have this in a software system. The biggest takeaway from this that I want to make sure that we all understand is this process is meant to evolve over time. So whatever system you're using, whether that is something that you're using in Word and you're printing it out and putting it in a manual, we need to make sure that we're evolving that, and that form or document or whatever way that we are marking this down forevermore has the ability to go in and easily change that as our conditions change, our environment changes, our industry changes. We have the ability to edit that and help us evolve over time as well. So again, this is just a visual, one way that you can do it. You'll see that I've highlighted there. The change management shall be performed under any of the following conditions. You see those 5 conditions there. These are just things that we, as our fictitious Polaris Aero LLC flight operation, have defined as indicators of things that we think should start and trigger a change management process. So you can sit down with your group and brainstorm ways or things that you think would have a lot of moving parts that you would like to establish a systematic approach for, and start with that. It doesn't have to be an all-encompassing list. There's always room for a revision 2 or a revision 3. And just like any auditor that will come in and talk to you about your stages through the progression, this should be a living, breathing document, just like your organization is. So moving into the next slide, we're going to talk about some examples. These are some things that we commonly see as opportunities for change management. The new scheduling system, a new aircraft type, and a new chief pilot. Hope y'all like the crown. That's a little pilot on pilot friendly fire there from Madeline and I. New king of the pilots, if you will. But we'll start with a new scheduling system. That's going to be our first example and just a way to walk through this particular process. Now, as we work our way down through the steps here, you'll see that they're loosely based on that ICAO Doc 9859. The first one being defining the change itself. So this definition of the change can come from the safety team, it can come from someone in the scheduling department, but ultimately it becomes a business process, right? So this is a business change. It's going to involve somebody going out and paying an invoice for a new scheduling system. So we really need to define why we're doing the change. And that can look something like this. Our team is evaluating a change in scheduling system providers from X to Y in an effort to leverage and list all the things that you're trying to gain from this, whether that's leveraging integrations with your existing systems, making us more efficient and effective, and realizing a cost savings maybe. All of those things can be in the definition of why you're trying to do the change itself. The next part is identifying who does this change impact, or what does this change impact? So we've got a couple of things there on any place where this scheduling system touches a person or a process. The first one being our schedulers. They're the ones that build out all of the trips. Once they build out the trips and send out those trip sheets will go to your EAs or your broker or your end user, your customer. Whoever's getting that trip sheet information will obviously have an impact there. Your flight ops team, when they review trips, they review crew currency, duty, rest requirements, or they go in and to release those trips, will obviously have an impact on the scheduling system decision as well. Maintenance may want to look into integrations with their maintenance planning software, their return to service process, anything like that. Flight crews, obviously, they also have a new trip sheet format to get through all the details, integrations with their flight planning software, submission of their out, off, in, and on times, expense submissions, etc. Accounting has to go in and pull those expenses that the pilots submit, generate reports for billing, and then of course the management team wants to be able to generate reports for operational insights as well. So this is a list of people and processes, just a quick off the cuff, who does this scheduling system touch? What processes does this scheduling system touch? Let's get them all together. We have a quick list of who we need to have in the room, and then let's talk these things through. Again, this may not be an extensive list. We may all get in the room and decide there need to be more people in the room, or there's more processes that we didn't even know existed that we need to include in our revision 2 or our follow-up meeting. But this is just a quick, again, off the cuff, who and what does this change impact? The third part of this is identifying hazards and potential outcomes. So out of this list, what we're going to do in this meeting that we have is identify all the places or that we identify hazards, risks, or potential outcomes from these processes. So in this particular example, we find out that we did a follow-up demo of the system and the flight operations team noticed a gap in the current process that we have for trip releases. And that would either require a change in the way that we release the trip or another means of releasing a trip altogether. And then that could lead into confusion with the pilots and scheduling team on understanding which trips are released and which trips aren't until we get that process figured out. So again, just a very real world example of how to identify the hazard and any potential outcomes that could come from that. You could copy paste that into something that the schedulers find or maintenance process, accounting process, etc. But just an example of that for a high level view. And then the last step would be implementing a risk control and then establishing a means of verifying the effectiveness of that risk control over time. So in this example, our employee John is going to work with the software provider as they develop this new, more robust release process that helps us establish this within the platform. But in the meantime, what we're actually going to do is just manually document trip releases with an ID and timestamp on the trip details page, and then verify in the next pilot meeting that that is going over well and people are understanding that. So all of this to say, in this particular example, it does not have to be rocket science. It could be very simple. It could just be documenting who, what, and then anything that comes out of those people and process hazards. We'll take a look at the next example and sort of chat through it a little bit. This would be your new chief pilot, right? So we've had a retirement or someone moving along the way that has created a hole that needs to be filled. And that role is a new chief pilot. We are looking at our group saying, okay, do we have any internal hires that we can promote into this position? Do we need to hire externally to fill this position? What are some things that we can talk about? As we bring someone into that role, we can use a different view of this, like the system description, to help us work through some of those conversations. So Madeline and I will kind of talk through this with you, but the first thing that comes to mind for me would be looking at our list of candidates. We have, let's say, 2 very strong candidates that come through. Maybe one's internal, one's external. We lean toward the internal candidate because they're part of the family, and we'd like to have them show that promotion and career growth. But there are some gaps there in terms of knowledge. So this particular pilot that we are considering from the internal position has always been on the Lear 45. He's been a great pilot on the Lear 45, but we are now transitioning to a Challenger fleet. And we need someone to fill that gap of knowledge, or some means of filling that gap of knowledge between the Lear 45 and the Challenger. So again, just a real world example of what that can look like. Madeline, I will let you talk through what it could look like in terms of going through these different nodes and looking at some other instances in the example of a new chief pilot as well that we might consider.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I mean, I think when it comes to something like this, there isn't a prescriptive method for it. So, you know, whatever works for you is best for you, right? I think you should always keep in mind your organization and how you process things and move forward with that. And so what comes to mind for me with something like this, and mind you, I know this is difficult to read if you're on a small screen, so I'll try to point some things out. But what I would probably do is take some time to just go around every one of these nodes and see any place where the chief pilot touches. And so I'll start with programs, right? We have fatigue management, pilot training, drug and alcohol, CAS, continuous analysis and surveillance, tool control, ASAP, VDRP, voluntary reporting program. Chief pilot touches a lot of those areas, so I'd probably earmark those areas and just move on to the next section just to kind of complete this initial example. So moving on to software, right? We've got are Outlook Microsoft, GEC VOCUS, scheduling software, and VOCUS. Well, we know that this individual, first of all, is going to need their Office and Microsoft accounts. They're going to need access to the scheduling software. They're going to need the appropriate access to the scheduling software. Same for VOCUS, which is their safety management system software. So that starts to kind of bring in maybe not even things that are really risk related, but just help you identify things that you need to remember need to be accounted for when you eventually do onboard such individual. Maybe, you know, pilot X internally that you're promoting already has his Outlook and Microsoft accounts, is very fluid with those, but the outsider guy isn't. Maybe he comes from a different software, Google completely, and that would be a steep learning curve for him. So now you may have a knowledge gap over here when it's in regard to aircraft, but you have a knowledge gap in regard to operating systems for a different individual, right? So you can start to weigh those things. Moving on to equipment, what type of equipment? We already talked a little bit about the fleet. Interfacing persons, what interfacing would that individual have with some of these external agencies like the FBO, the rental car facility, the Flight Crews Unlimited for your contract pilots, MROs, caterers. Maybe the chief pilot was the person who managed the relationship with the FBO, and now you're going to have to transition that relationship as well. Might not seem risky at face value, but when you start to unpack all the layers of that, there are probably things first and foremost that are tribal knowledge of an individual who could be leaving that position that they might have in their relationship with that FBO. And so that's something that really needs to be vetted more holistically, so that you can put the right person in the right seat so that they can maintain that type of interface. Moving on to the operating environment, where are you operating? What regulations do you have to abide by? Here I wrote FAR 91 and 135 for domestic. Something that comes to mind there is what requirements would there be of a chief pilot in their position and their name in relationship with the FAA, right? That might not actually fit under the operating environment of FARs, but FARs remind me of the FAA and reminds me of that relationship and our OB specs and all of these hurdles that we have to go through with the FAA in order to change out the chief pilot individual and establish that relationship. So there's another component. Then you move on to facilities. Quick thing that comes to mind is security in and out of that facility. Again, not super high risk at face value, but eventually they're going to need to have the right, have taken the right, tests to get the right badges, to get the right amount of access to the right facilities and the hangars and such. So again, not risky at face value, but if there's a gap there and that isn't done, or it's not done effectively, or there's an issue, that could potentially lead to something more systemic down the line. And then, of course, departments and people, and that one's fairly obvious. There would be a key change there, not only in the person, but also in taking over the management of this whole other group of people who are, key stakeholders in this conversation. So you can start to see all these little threads of things that start to matter. And what I want to encourage you to think about is that though this web kind of branches out, there are a lot of interconnected pieces here too that we can identify, but also there are a lot of things, remember complexity, that we can't identify. And so just because we might not see a risk associated with something related to facilities security, that doesn't mean that one couldn't still present itself at some point. And so at least documenting that it was initially considered can help you in the future to look back and say, no, I didn't forget about it, but it just wasn't something that was part of my consideration at that point in time, given what we knew at that time. So now maybe I need to pivot and add a risk control to move forward.
Absolutely, that's a great point.
Go ahead, Kelly.
No, absolutely, that's a great point. Just noting how things are interconnected, and then making sure that, again, you're documenting from the initial perspective, hey, we thought about this, let's keep this in mind for the next one so we can build on it as it goes, because that may be relevant the next time you do this when the conditions are a little bit different, or the people that you're considering for this change may be a little bit different too. So that's a great point. We'll take the same sort of concept. Again, this is just another visual way to look at this. The first one we mapped out in sort of a jotting it down on paper view. This one is a more visual way. The last one that we're going to look at is a new aircraft type. I know this is one that we've used quite a bit, or at least that we see quite often or commonly out in the field. And we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to define the change. We're going to look at who or what does this impact, identify hazards and potential outcomes, and then establish those risk controls and verify the effectiveness. So same process, but we're just going to do it a little bit different way. And this one would be inside of a software platform. So if you are using a software platform, this is what this would look like on the next slide as we work our way through those questions. So again, defining the change, who does this impact? This is one that I would challenge you to make sure that we are looking at the different environment and industry environments that we're in right now. So it may not just be that it impacts the pilot group and how we are hiring either internally to fill this role on the new aircraft or externally to bring someone in. But it may also be that now that we've got a new aircraft type on the field, we also are competing for pilots with the guy next door in the hangar who's got the same aircraft and maybe a slower flying schedule, or goes to Cabo instead of going to some, Kalamazoo. I don't know. Those are the sorts of things that we have to loop in HR and make sure that they're supporting us and making those hiring decisions. That may not have been a consideration when we were flying a different fleet type. So making sure, again, that we've got this in a system that we can identify different hazards and different challenges along the way to make sure that we're remaining effective and it's working for the size and scope of what we're doing and for the environment that we're working in. So the who or what does this impact, and we, again, defining that and bringing all the people in the room to collaborate, and then putting this into the system. This is what it would look like to identify hazards and potential outcomes. And then down there at the bottom, you'll see establishing risk controls and verifying effectiveness. Again, this system gives you a way to prompt yourself. It works on a wizard-based system that pops up in your face, all the different ways that this could be a hazard or all the different risks to consider, and then walks you through the outcome path to tack those outcomes onto a hazard. And then once you establish those risk controls, you can task those out to different people to make sure that those are getting done and being completed, and then set tasks for yourself to come back and verify that they're effective. So whether that's as we're going through a conformity process in a 135 environment, or 6 months from now when we have our first meeting with the owner, whatever that looks like for you, we can task that out and make sure that it's remaining effective over time. The great thing about having it within a system like this is that we can come back and reference it at the next time that we bring on a new aircraft type, or use it for conversation moving forward for things that we've addressed along the way. It certainly gives us insights for that as well, and then prompts some different discussions. So I know that I've talked a lot about examples and different ways to do that. Ultimately, it comes down to a people, process, and technology concept, which is on my next slide there. Everything that you'll hear me talk about from the services side here of what I'm doing at VOCUS is built on people, process, and technology. And you have to have the people that you on your team that are well trained. They feel engaged and empowered to tackle something like change management. They feel encouraged to reach out to people beyond their own safety silo to help complete this process as well. Your processes have to be in line, right? We have to have a systematic way to work through this change and make sure that it's documented, that it's consistent, but it's flexible enough to be able to evolve and adapt over time for our current environment. And then technology to help us do all of those things, to lean on that, to help make sure that it's meaningful, that we're gaining meaningful insight out of all of it. And then ultimately, we want this to be a holistic process, right? So beyond the people, process, and technology part of it, having the lens and looping in people outside of your network even to make sure that we can see things that maybe we couldn't see before, right? So making this a more holistic conversation with people outside of your flight department even that have been through this process before. Leveraging your contractors or vendors or people on our services team to help walk through these things based on what we're seeing from other people in the industry. Certainly don't hesitate to do that. It could be a very beneficial thing because you don't know what you don't know, right? So we'll move into some key takeaways from this slide. And again, we're going to start with the why, kind of some full circle moment here. The why, again, is just balancing the business risk or the opportunity of doing better things for our business and keeping that in mind as we balance the risk associated with that change, right? So the business gain versus the risk at hand, and then making sure as we're navigating the regulations and making sure that we're remaining compliant, that it's also remaining relevant to our organization based on size and scope. So keeping the why in mind as you navigate that is very important as well. The next one there is for Madeline. I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So that is, don't reinvent the wheel, something that I've already mentioned earlier. And what I really mean by this is you're already doing a lot of these practices already: safety risk management, safety assurance. So all you need to do is think about a different way that these things can be initiated. And the initiation is some sort of change in your system. And if you've defined your system and you see a new input or removal of something from that system, that then is going to initiate that change management for you. That's not the only thing that could initiate it. Obviously, you saw our fictitious examples earlier. And there are a lot of other guidance documents that you can reference for what triggering conditions may be, but that's really the most unique component of change management. The third then is to also start simple and build over time. Start with defining what your team thinks constitutes a change management process based on the things that you're already doing, and define it. And it can be on a cocktail napkin, probably not if you're wanting to pass that to an auditor, but maybe on a Word document, and just jot down what it is that that you're doing and what other pieces of your SMS you can kind of plug in to that process for whatever makes sense for the size and scope of your operation. It could be extremely elaborate if you want to be detailed, but it doesn't have to be. And we saw that in what's really required of us by ICAO standards, and then IS-BAO as well. So you can do that visually, you can write it out, but the second component to this is this evolution over time. So we can continue to keep reevaluating this process, and we saw that with Kelly's screenshot of the policy for change management as well. It's in an editable form so that we can continue to edit it and continue to modify that process as we become better and better and better with with the process that we've engaged in. Kelly, back to you.
Yes, and then the last one is just making sure you don't go it alone, right? This isn't a safety silo experiment, right? You don't have to operate in the silo itself. While you are the one being tasked with change management and you are the one who is meant to lead this conversation, that doesn't mean that you have to take it all on yourself. So it's not just even about delegating, it's about leveraging the knowledge base of your entire flight department to help you make those subject matter expertise decisions on each place that change management will affect each department. So, and as I mentioned before, it can even go outside the scope of your organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be just your scheduling team, your maintenance team, and your flight crews. Reach outside to people in your network, folks there at your local airport, people that are in similar operations, anything like that, even leveraging like local and regional groups to connect with people that are in similar situations. That could be a great way to bring things back to your organization that maybe you didn't know before. Even leveraging your vendors and third-party resources to be able to bring in insights that maybe you haven't thought about yet. Don't hesitate to do that to help expand the knowledge base once you've got that foundation built for your change management process. So again, those are just the key takeaways for today's presentation and what we wanted to make sure that we drove home. Madeline, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, the only final one there is something that's a super hot topic, especially with our own clients as well, and that is this concept of having change management templates, predefined templates that tell you the things that you need to care about. And while there are a lot of similarities in how we all operate, so you add a new aircraft, there are certain things that you're always going to want to consider. We haven't really ever found a good repository for those types of templates, but they probably exist, and maybe they don't exist with the name template, but maybe it just exists because you know an operator that just went through a change and you just want to reference what it is that they did so you don't miss anything. It's not about copying, it's not about we're better than you or you're better than us or anything like that. Really, it's for the greater good, but the point being is that they have a certain perspective that may not be 100% applicable to you, but certainly something that you could potentially utilize. Now, us as safety software providers can also do our part to help in that, and that's something that Polaris Aero is engaging in over the next year here, is to kind of define potentially some of these templates and whatnot. But again, the whole point is a lot of these changes are things that a lot of people have already done before. And if we can find ways to collaborate, to share that sort of information, we begin to kind of broaden our perspective on all of these areas of our very complex system that can be affected. And then we can just move forward with our own organizational practices that we've identified to actually take that information and move it through the hazard identification, risk management, and safety assurance processes to see that through to completion.
No, that's great, Madeline. I think too, that's what we've seen a lot on our side is the greatest change or the greatest leaps in making gains in safety in your own department comes when you even reach outside of your own department there. I know we've got a slide up that has the sales email listed there, but the sales team has contacts with all of our customers all over the world. And if you need to connect with someone who's in a similar situation to you, who's using the same scheduling provider or the same flight planning solution, the same safety system, we can certainly help you do that. We have a way to connect you. We can put you in touch and you guys can just brainstorm together. We've seen a lot of success in that.
Thanks, Kelly. Catherine, back to you.
Madeline and Kelly knocked it out of the park. Thank you so much. Once again, you have managed to break this process down into understandable steps, giving us great considerations, just, taking it one foot in front of the other. One comment from the audience, Brian out in the audience said, finally, a practical webinar about SMS change management, not only showing practical examples, you both showed how simple this entire process can be. Thank you to you both. So I wanted to put that out there first. You really did break this down into just some very easy ways to do this. I love the napkin example. I'm guessing that there are some auditors out there who have, in fact, seen a napkin as a record of something. And my favorite quote from this is, we don't want to safety ourselves out of business. So how can we do this in a way that's really practical and that fits the needs, and that, as you sort of stressed all along, that evolves over time, and that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I do have a couple of questions. One of these is, there's actually two that go together here. One is it usually the responsibility of the safety manager to initiate the management of change process in an airline or an operation? And with that, what would a good change manager look like? What are the attributes of that? So how does those things fit together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the first thing that I'm going to encourage you to look at, again, is what the standards say. And the standard doesn't say anything about it. So really, it can be whoever it needs to be, whoever makes sense. And the type of your organization and the complexity of your organization is going to probably drive a lot of that. If you have a very strong safety culture where you have a lot of safety-minded managers in place, change management isn't probably something that you need to initiate. It's probably something that will be initiated by one of them, because they might be the one actually undergoing the change or leading that change, and then by nature just naturally fall into completing that change management process. In other organizations that don't have that type of culture, it would likely fall on the safety manager to kind of put the hand up and say, hey, looks like we're about to embark in this change. We have some work that we need to do around this according to our manual or something of that nature. So the question is, it depends, or the answer is, it depends, really. And I think having an honest look internally at your organization, not putting undue expectations on other people to do something that they're not comfortable with, that they don't have the knowledge base for, is something that you need to consider in that discussion as well. And then as far as attributes for a good change manager, whoever that might be, one of the big attributes that I think is critically important is the ability or the willingness to kind of suspend your own thoughts, to recognize that you don't have all of this knowledge, and to invite not only people to engage in conversation, but also to invite dissenting opinion. There could very well be not necessarily conflict, but just a difference of opinions in how the change could affect the organization and things that might need to be done. But it's in that area, it's in that space that you're actually going to make really meaningful change. So you need to be able to embrace that. I think that that's one really key attribute. And the second is communication. We talk about it all the time in so many areas. It transcends everything. Our ability to actually have conversations in a meaningful way, in a direct way, in a pointed way, that's actually going to explain the process or move the conversation in the place it needs to be, so that we can identify our system description, so that we can see the piece of the description that are going to be adjusted, so that we can have conversations around hazard identification, is really important. So those communication skills, I'm not just talking about the ability to pick up the phone and call someone or to send an email in a timely manner, but actually the ability to absorb information and regurgitate it in a way that makes sense to your audience. I think those are two very critical points.
I think too, Madeline, if I could tag on to that one, what I'm hearing you say is the person who's tapped for this safety manager responsibility needs to be a leader. They need to have leadership qualities. We have the regulation and the guidance to prop you up in that regard. You have a team of subject matter experts that can speak into how this affects them on a departmental level. But those leadership qualities you're talking about, I mean, that's something that has to be really a priority, to be able to collaborate and have humility that you don't know it all, and then promote those voices of people that are subject matter experts to speak into the process and then see it to completion.
Yeah, and that humility plays right into the emotional intelligence that's required of a leader. So it's absolutely spot on, Kelly. I agree.
Awesome. You guys hit some really important and welcome points in that response. A follow-on to this just came in. It says, when management is 3/4 of the way through a change and haven't included the SMS, any suggestions on how to get your foot in the door?
Yeah, great question. I'll take my stab and then I'll pass over to you, Kelly. This happened in an organization I used to work at as well, where the change management was kind of an afterthought, like the change was gonna happen whether I was on board or not. And so I just kind of had to insert myself. So, you know, again, you know your organization best. So you know who you can probably approach, maybe who you shouldn't approach, because there'll be a little bit more conflict there. So first of all, just don't ignore that. I'm not going to give you some magic answer and a wave of a wand and tell you can go and do something and put you in a bad situation. So what I would encourage you to do though is just, maybe it doesn't need to be as direct of an injection into these conversations of, oh, hey guys, we need to do this. But you can start to ask questions. We start to ask questions back to people like, hey, have you thought about this, or have you looked at this segment that could be affected and documented any of that? Because I'm very interested and also concerned about the implications, the ramifications, and I'd like to make sure that we're addressing these risks effectively. When you start to inject those little kind of questions and conversations, then you can start to kind of garner a little bit more attention towards a actual process that is defined for actually doing this. So it's a hard battle. It's not a battle worth tossing to the wayside. You absolutely should still consider change management, regardless of the state that you're in, whether you're all the way through the change, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through. Obviously, we encourage you to do it at the very onset. But if it's not done, then at any point is better than none at all. So that's my few cents. Kelly?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And even if you're, 3/4 of the way through the process, there's still something to be gained from documenting that process, so that the next time you run through this process, we're not starting from scratch. And I mean, if you're in a situation where you have not been involved in the past, then part of getting your foot in the door is going to probably involve you being the devil's advocate in a lot of meetings. And just, again, like Madeline said, raising your hand saying, have you thought about this? Or, lifting people up that have those subject matter expert questions, knowing that those are things that they are concerned about, and putting those on a level where they can be heard if that's a position that you're in. So those are some things that you can do. I would say probably the most, depending on the dynamic, but the most effective thing you can do to make sure you are included in those meetings moving forward is to find a piece of the change management that maybe did not address a risk that has a financial impact. If it hits the bottom line, that's something that is going to catch the attention of the people that maybe aren't including you in those meetings. And once you find that nerve, if that is a nerve, which for most management people it is, you will be included in those meetings moving forward, I'm sure.
Yeah, a great example that Kelly just comes to mind from something that I went through in the past, which was we were onboarding a new aircraft at a new location, and they weren't involving us in that process. And about halfway through is when they realized that one of these risks associated, financially speaking, was that they needed a completely new tug because the type of tug that they had didn't have the appropriate tow bar. They couldn't, or the weight limits appropriate for that aircraft. So they had to buy a completely new tug, and you know how much those things cost. And so not that necessarily would have changed the decision making, but it would have saved a lot of headache and heartache down the line. So good point there.
Yeah, no, certainly that, or even in our, I know we use this one a lot, but the new aircraft type example, if you're bringing a new aircraft type on, and that means you need to go to a new third-party maintenance provider, and no one's done the due diligence on that yet to figure out that their quotes are higher, or we have to reposition the aircraft to a different location, and that's going to cost us, I mean, anything that you can point out that shows a dollar sign on it certainly helps you get involved in those conversations. That's a great example, Madeline.
That question touched on a very touched a nerve. I think that's good. These things are not happening in isolation. Speaking of not happening in isolation, you mentioned not being in a safety silo, and this one question: if I wanted to reach out to my network for help, what would that look like?
Sure.
Yeah,
So yeah, if you could, if it's someone, you know, again, outside of your flight organization, you can reach out to people at your local airfield, at your airport, people that you know there. If you don't have anyone that you know that's in a safety role and you want to connect, reach out to us. We'll put you in touch with some other safety officers. We'll try to link you up with people that are in a similar type of organization or have a similar flight profile or similar software adaptation. We're happy to do that. Leveraging your local and regional groups. Things like I mean, every local and regional group now just about has some sort of safety day, or even at least a virtual safety day that you can log in and get to know people, or the regional safety roundtable. So just being there, being present, and not being afraid to raise your hand and say, hey, we're going through X, Y, and Z, and I'd love to figure out if there's anyone else here who's been through that and would like to share stories on that, because a rising tide lifts all ships, and we're all here to get better and learn from each other.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that as well is if you aren't in a position necessarily where you want to be connected with another safety manager, maybe you just want to maintain kind of a little bit more of a silo between your relationship and this external entity that you're engaging with. Companies like ours, but also NBAA has resources as well, and all over the world, I'm sure. But we're willing to engage in these conversations with you without involving any other operator, because we do see a lot and we have these conversations a lot, and we typically will likely have a response to whatever question or issue it is that you want to bring up with us. But we also invite, again, that dissenting opinion as well. We're willing to engage and challenge our own thoughts and paradigms too, if need be. And so I think that generally just progresses the conversation as well, and maybe a little bit more of a confidential way if you don't want to kind of expose your secrets, or if you will, to a different operator.
Great information. Thank you. We're definitely over time. I do have a couple of questions here that ask specifically about how VOCUS works, and what is it best to contact you all at that sales@Polaris Aero email? Okay. I've been putting that out there. I will put that in the messages as well. And do you guys have any closing thoughts before we sign off for the day?
Go for it, Madeline.
Thanks. I appreciate anyone who stuck around this long. I know it's been a long one, so I appreciate it. And again, hopefully we've given you a little bit more confidence in knowing what's actually required of you and what's expected of you versus what you can reference for guidance, to give you kind of some of that latitude and encourage you to really design something that's actually going to work for you. If you design something just based on some other guidance or some other operator, the likelihood that it's actually going to work in the way that you want it to for your organization is fairly low, I would say. And so just keep that in mind. If you're not doing it, it's not going to work, right? So whatever's going to get you to actually do the change management, take that first step. And that's very defendable, especially to a regulator or an auditor. And then you can only go up from there. Kelly?
Yep, absolutely. That's a great point. And also, don't be afraid to reach out. If there's anything that we can do to assist you or at least get you started, something to get you out of the starting blocks on this. If you feel stuck, reach out to us. We'd love to brainstorm with you, help you get off on the right foot, and make this a success for you. So thanks again for everyone who joined in today. And clearly, we can talk about this all day. So if anyone wants to give us a shout and talk through some additional points, we're happy to chat with you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone at IBAC, for having us. We really enjoy doing these sessions.
Yes, thank you both for being here, and everyone at Polaris Aero for supporting the SafetyNet series. You guys do an incredible job. For everyone that's still in the audience, this session is recorded, so you will be able to access this through the IBAC.org website under webinars. And feel free to reach out to Madeline or Kelly. I've put the sales email back in the comments in the chat. And we love having you. I know we'll see you again soon. And I look forward to that. Once again, there's so many thank yous coming in for just an excellent presentation, breaking this what can be a mysterious process down into some really straightforward, usable steps. So we appreciate your efforts and your clear explanations and examples. Thank you everyone for being here, and we will see you on the next IS-BAO SafetyNet webinar. Have a great day.